Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Dr. Earl Turner. I am a psychologist and assistant professor of psychology at Pepperdine University. I am also the current president of APA Division 37, the Society for Child and Family Policy and Practice. For over 400 years, Black people in America have experienced racial injustice and oppression. The recent killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd have provided us an opportunity to act for change. I'm humbled to moderate this esteemed panel today. Before we begin, I will do brief introductions of our speakers. First, Dr. Byron McClure is a national certified school psychologist in the Washington, D.C. area. His work centers around influencing systemic change and ensuring students from high poverty communities have access to quality education. Dr. McClure has extensive knowledge and expertise in mental health, social emotional learning, and behavior. He has done considerable work advocating for fair and equitable discipline practices for all children, particularly for African American boys. He has designed and implemented school-wide initiatives such as social and emotional learning, restorative practices, responsive intervention, and trauma-responsive practices. Our next presenter is Dr. Rihanna Anderson. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education at the University of Michigan's School of Public Health. She uses mixed methods in clinical interventions to study racial discrimination and socialization in Black families to reduce racial stress and trauma and improve psychological well-being and family functioning. Dr. Anderson is the developer and director of the Embrace, Engaging, Managing, and Bonding Through Race intervention, and loves to translate her work for a variety of audiences, particularly those whom she serves in communities via blogs, videos, and literary articles. Finally, Dr. Howard C. Stevenson is the Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the executive director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative, designed to promote racial literacy in education, health, and community institutions. His most recent work focuses on helping children and adults develop and use assertive coping strategies during face-to-face microaggressions. Key to this racial healing work is the use of culture to reduce in-the-moment threat reactions and increase access to memory, physical mobility, and voice. I also want to offer a special thanks to our partners, the Vincent J. Fontana Center for Child Protection. Today's webinar is also hosted by the Division 37 Presidential Task Force on Advancing Social and Emotional Development of Black Boys through Research, Advocacy, and Community Engagement. If you are not a member of Division 37, please feel free to take a screenshot of the slide, and you can be able to get more information about joining our organization. I'll turn it over to Dr. McClure.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. First, I would like to begin by sending my sincere appreciation and showing gratitude for the Vincent J. Fontana Center for inviting me to be a panelist. Also, thank you to Division 37 of the American Psychological Association. I also want to send a special thank you to Dr. Scott Grace, who recommended me to be part of this panel, as well as Dr. Turner and my esteemed colleagues who are part of this panel discussion. This is a very important conversation. It is a critical conversation that we must have within the Black community and across the nation at large. And that topic is on strengthening the development of Black boys. I want to begin by framing this conversation with two very critical acknowledgments. The first acknowledgement is that it's okay not to be okay. I acknowledge that many of us, we are not okay given the current climate, as we are facing so many issues socially, emotionally, mentally, physically, especially the current state of the tragic murder and lynching of George Floyd. It's okay not to be okay. You may feel tired, frustrated, or even angry, and that's okay. I hope that this will be a space for honest and authentic dialogue. I also hope that this will be a space where we can come together and begin this process of healing. The second acknowledgement, I want to be very clear in stating that America and consequently the American education system are rooted deeply in inequality. In order for us to genuinely and authentically strengthen the development of Black boys, I believe that we must relentlessly work towards immediately abolishing any system rooted in inequality. We must become disruptors. I am a huge proponent of trauma responsive schools. Part of trauma responsive schools is predictability, making sure that we are sticking to a routine and expectations. I want to begin my presentation by just giving us a framework of the direction that we'll be headed in. My presentation is broken down into three different areas. The first is simply reviewing the challenges that Black boys have faced. The second is offering solutions to those challenges. And then third, wrapping up with the optimistic closing. I wanted to capture this picture also to, again, frame this conversation and just give some of the historical context of some of the challenges and to stress and really reiterate the point that America and consequently its education system is rooted in grounds of inequality. I'll begin this talk by sharing some of the challenges that our Black boys face being here in America. And I'll begin with this quote from James Baldwin. And it says, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time." I wanted to share this again for framing purposes, but also to state that if we show an inkling, as people say, being woke, of being conscious, then that means we understand the systemic oppression, the barriers, and indeed the challenges being Black in America might present. Now, with this, some of the biggest challenges that African Americans and people in general might face are dealing with the impacts of poverty. In fact, when we look at some data from Alter in 2017, he found that poverty among African Americans exceeds that of any other group. He further went on to say that while poverty appears to be declining for whites, Hispanics, and Asian families across recent years, it hasn't declined for African Americans. In 2015, some data emerged showing that some 38% of Black children live below the poverty line, not at poverty. We're talking about below, beneath the poverty line. And that percentage is 4 times greater than that of white or Asian children. This matters because youth who live in poverty are more likely to have experienced 3 or more ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, or simply put, they are major disruptions that happens during the course of a child's life. Dr. Robert Block, who is the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, said that adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. Many people will also argue that racism is perhaps the greatest unaddressed public health threat. Two things can be true. In this context, we're discussing how adverse childhood experiences are a major issue and a major challenge facing Black boys today. Now, within ACEs, there are 3 types of ACEs. There are 10 total, broken down into 3 categories or 3 types. Those categories go into abuse, which includes physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. We look at neglect. There are 2 types of neglect, physical and emotional, and then household dysfunction. And this includes things such as mental illness, incarcerated relative, a brother, sister, cousin, someone who you know who is close to you who has been incarcerated, a mother who has been treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. Interestingly, in the initial research that came out around ACEs, it did not include racism. This matters especially because we see you can date back 400 years, racism, systemic oppression, and look at how that has impacted African Americans. That in and of itself is a traumatic experience. So we can't discount the role that racism plays on youth. As a consequence, many youth, especially Black youth who have 3 or more ACEs, will not have their basic needs met. This leads to Black boys are more likely to experience stressors. As a school psychologist, my focus has always been and traditionally has been rooted in how Black boys can develop to develop the skills that they need to be successful in school. Well, given the aforementioned challenges that I've mentioned, we see that these stressors, these barriers can be challenges that prevents Black boys from being successful inside of the school setting. This includes things such as poor nutrition, high rates of crime, unsafe living conditions, and even chronic exposure to racism. It's also important to consider Black boys have increased risk factors inside of school. All right, this leads to overall challenges. And I broke this down into 3 categories. This includes poor academic achievement, behavior problems, over and under representation. When we look at poor academic achievement, I pulled, and this really gives a really good snapshot when we look at reading data. Only 18% of Black 4th graders, based on recent data, score proficient or above in reading compared to 45% of white students. When you look at 8th graders, the percentages were 15% proficient for Black students and 42% proficient for white students. All right. This is an issue because data research shows that students who enter into school with the inability or difficulty reading have less favorable outcomes into later adulthood, including things like being able to get a job, economically, so on and so forth. The next area where we see challenges are behavior problems. And if you all haven't had an opportunity, please go to the ProPublica website. At the end, I'll be able to share my slides with you all. But ProPublica, they've compiled all of this data from the U.S. Department of Ed, and they give us some data and they broke it down into maps. It's a really cool system to check out. But based on some of that data, we see that Black students are 4 times as likely to be suspended compared to white students. In DC, where I work, we see that number is 11.7 times as likely to be suspended compared to white students. This is, it's ridiculous. It's a travesty, and we must do something about it. In terms of overrepresentation and underrepresentation, Black youth are underrepresented in gifted and AP classes. When we look at national data, we see that 13% of Asian students are enrolled in gifted programs, while 8% of white students are enrolled in gifted programs, but only 4% of Black students are enrolled in gifted programs. In Maryland, where I attended schools in Prince George's County, we see 39% of Asian students are enrolled in gifted programs, 17% of white students, but only 11% of Black students. Yes, this is higher than the national level, but looking at it within the state of Maryland, we are still significantly behind white students and behind Asian students. And then when you look at placement in AP classes, we see that white students are almost twice as likely to be placed in AP classes. This is an issue because we're talking about access, all right? Now, let's talk briefly about being overrepresented. Black youth are also overrepresented in several school categories, especially special education, discipline referrals, expulsion, so on and so forth. Black students are more likely to be referred. Let's start there, meaning they see some type of difficulty, whether it be academic, behavior, emotional, and they're more likely to be referred for these issues for special education. Once they're at the table, they're more likely to be placed, meaning that they're qualified to receive special education services. And we also have to consider the types of labels or categories that our students are qualifying for. oftentimes they're receiving the harshest labels: intellectually disabled, emotionally disabled, oftentimes twice as often as white students. This is important because it leads to African American boys being segregated and not having access, which is a major problem. All right. So when we put all this together, we see that Black boys have challenges before they hit the door, once they're in school, and this leads to their emotional needs not really being met. So here are some solutions for you all. And this is just a start. I broke it down into 5 areas. The first area is we have to promote equity-centered policies and practices. We have to eradicate, abolish, get rid of racist, inequitable practices and policies such as zero tolerance. We have to do this with a strength-based approach. All right. If we're talking about strengthening and development Black boys, we have to do so from a strength-based approach. And I'll talk about that quickly. We have to promote social emotional learning and development and healing centered practices. The 4th step here is connections through relationships, engagement, and involvement in extracurricular activities, and the parental and community support. The first step, we're discussing policy, being able to impact policy. As I stated, this was all by design. The American education system has founded itself in being inequitable, especially for Black boys and those of color. So we must be able to examine sources. Where are these rates of disproportionality coming from, whether it be special education, discipline referrals, suspension, expulsion, as well as being placement and gifted and AP classes. We have to look at policies such as zero tolerance, discipline, grading. In my school, shout out to Anacostia High School in DC, there's conversations around making grading more equitable for students, especially Black boys. Also, we have to get rid of these racist policies out here that are harming Black boys and girls around hair and uniform. We have to fully fund mental health personnel. The National Association of School Psychologists recommends one psych to 500 and 700 students, making sure that we have enough psychs. So that leads to making sure that we have mental health services and that is fully funded so that we can provide these services to Black students. The second thing is approaching this from a strength-based approach, like I mentioned earlier. Oftentimes when we're talking about Black boys, we're looking at what's wrong. It's negative, it's deficit-based. We have to shift that to look at the strengths. We're kings based on rich traditions and history. We must be able to accept that, acknowledge that, and focus on what's right. Shifting the mindset from what's wrong to what's strong with our Black boys. The third step is building out, and this is my research. I'm strong. I do a ton of work around SEL, but building up self-awareness, social awareness, self-management skills, responsible decision-making skills, and relationship skills. I'm approaching the end of my time. This is why I'm going through this quickly, but SEL development is extremely appropriate and necessary to developing strong Black boys. The 4th step is Black boys. I was a Black boy. I have a Black son. We thrive off relationships. Connecting through relationships, engagement, and activities is important. It's key. And then lastly, there's a lot of research that lends to supporting the development, supporting families, supporting strong community structures for Black youth will lead to development of Black boys, especially when you look at parental factors, limiting and setting discipline is important. Nurturing relationships, love, caring relationships are all key and important to developing healthy Black boys. So as I wrap up, one of my favorite quotes is from a quote that I had to learn while I was in college. Shout out to the Brotherhood Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And the poem is called Don't Quit. So we are living in a tough time. We're fighting racism. And as we're in this fight, I'll leave with this. So stick to the fight when your heart is hit. It's when things seem worse that you must not quit. Don't quit. Yes, we might be tired, we may be angry, we may be frustrated, but now is the time to fight. Arm up yourselves with knowledge, with resources, with structure. We must come together and join this fight together so that we can end oppressive systems, so that we can raise strong Black boys. Thank you for your time.
Afterward, we'll turn it over to Dr. Anderson.
All right, can folks see that?
Yes.
I'm trying to, sorry, my controls seem to have, I'm not able to see how to put myself on video. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing option.
There should be a place at the bottom for a video screen.
Yeah, all of my buttons are kind of gone now. I'm not sure what's going on.
That's okay. Can we just proceed with that if that's okay?
Yeah, I look great. Y'all can just trust me on that. All right. So again, thankful to the folks who are organizing this. And my goal anyway was to center the voices of Black boys. And so I'm excited to represent them. And I do not come as myself anyway. So it may even be best that I'm not seen, because it really is about the Black boys that you're going to see today. So I'm going to talk from the perspective of lessons from the Embrace intervention, and we'll talk a bit about what Embrace is in just a bit. But before we get started, just wanting to give all power and peace to George Floyd and countless others whose lives have been snatched from racial discrimination and some of the practices we'll be talking about today. So what is racial discrimination? Well, it's the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people on the grounds of race. We know that at least 90% of Black adults and youth as young as 8 have reported at least one racially discriminatory experience in the past year, but recent data actually show that this daily average, particularly with respect to social media, is much higher. In fact, about 5+ instances a day. And we know that that does matter with respect to what your sex is. So we know that Black boys experience the lion's share of racial discrimination. The reason that we get to such high numbers is because there are a variety of discriminatory and racial experiences. So Dr. McClure already discussed some of them, but essentially they can happen to me. I can watch them on TV. I might think that something is racial while somebody else may not. It might be a microaggression. It can be in a school setting. It could be between individuals, but so many ways that this can manifest in the life of a child. One of the things that happens in that manifestation is that the discriminatory experience leads to stress and trauma. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm very concerned with the ways that discrimination manifests in the life of youth. So we consider this racial stress and trauma because of the different types of experiences. It can happen as soon as the experience is occurring or years later, so that can be chronic or acute with respect to that. And we're also seeing some of this stress and trauma come up in the midst of these racial conversations. So we'll get to that in just a bit. But knowing that parenting a Black boy in the United States can be an incredibly scary experience for a lot of Black parents is something that you'll see in the midst of a lot of these racially discriminatory experiences on social media. So if you have colleagues or peers or friends who are parents to Black children, or even expecting a Black boy, you see tons of anecdotes of how nervous they are to have a Black boy in this environment, and what their fear is around keeping them safe. If you're still not quite sure what racial stress and trauma is, I want you to take a listen to AJ, who's 10, describe what he experienced in 2016 as the biggest problem facing his group.
What are the problems that we're facing today? Racism, cops killing Black people. It's like mostly about like racist. Like cops is killing Black people, and the cops that kill Black people is white.
Okay.
You know what to say?
So what do you think What do you think that means? Like, expand on that for me. Talk to me about that.
So what I mean about that, like the black people don't like, the white people don't like the black people. So like the cops is like trying to get rid of the black people faster, so they can live longer, but they just trying to get rid of them.
Why do you think that is? How does it feel when you see things like that?
Hurt.
So here we see AJ, who's 10, describing the hurt that he's experiencing from witnessing this vicarious discrimination on TV. So what are the problems? Sorry. And we know that some of those media depictions, for example, what we're witnessing again and again, being focused on Black boys and men, can be particularly challenging in real life and also through various shows. So to the left, you're seeing some of the characters from The Wire, but you're seeing an onslaught of what it means to be a Black boy in the United States via the media. We also know that child sex is associated with differential parental depression. So parents of Black boys may be experiencing something quite differently, again, because of this fear. And it also comes out in the practices where mothers, quote, love their sons and raise their daughters. So they're trying to just protect their sons the best way that they can and are fearful that anything that they do may impact their sons' livelihood and well-being. We also know that child psychosocial outcomes or their psychological wellness is different based on sex. And that's this identity of boys will be boys, letting them be rough and tumble, but that has really different consequences for Black boys in school settings or in places where authorities make decisions on what happens to those Black boys who are expressing themselves differently. You also heard AJ talk about it hurting, and what he does with that hurt is something that we discuss in the Embrace intervention, but it's not often that boys are going to use expressive language. They're not encouraged to do so through socialization processes. So compromise coping in this way, I won't talk too much about it, but the long story short is that Black youth use different strategies when they experience racial discrimination. They're not using the same types of strategies that they would for a general stressor. So say AJ knew what he wanted to say when somebody picks on him at school, but when that picking at school is racially based, he doesn't want to confront it perhaps in the same way. And those types of approaches actually don't even show the same outcomes if we were to use those same strategies. So there's a lot around coping that we don't understand with racial discrimination. We do know, however, that Black parents do attempt to socialize their children around racialized experiences in the United States. So countless media will tell us the experience of after one of these highly publicized racial incidents, there's an uptick in the amount of conversations happening with Black children. You can see that even in some of the news articles that are focusing on the content that the folks on this panel are working on. We've been really tapped recently to talk about, well, how do we have the talk with our Black children? But the reality, again, is that these are systems, as Dr. McClure indicated. It's not going to be one incident and the world is different now. Like, these are systems of hundreds of years that have been impacting our Black youth. So having these conversations, not as one talk, not as the talk, but a series of talks, which I'm sure Dr. Stevenson will give us more information about in just a bit. This talk is considered racial socialization within the literature. There are 4 strategies that parents often use. Cultural socialization is around pride messaging. Preparation for bias is preparing our children for the racial world around them, like putting their hands on 10 and 2 at the wheel or taking their hoodie off when they go into a store. Promotion of mistrust is the idea that we can't, or teaching our children that we can't trust everyone around us, particularly those who have wronged us, and we have a generalized way of thinking about that group with respect to trust. And least often used, but most often used by Black fathers, actually, is egalitarianism or colorblindness. And so these are parents who are trying to keep their children away from this idea that discrimination has to happen to them. But in our world, in our reality, we know that it often does. Again, I'm going to leave this to Dr. Stevenson. I'm sure he's going to unpack this quite a bit, but he developed the racial encounter coping, appraisal, and socialization theory, and we refreshed it and updated it in a recent publication where we're showing how racial socialization actually interrupts what happens from discriminatory stressors and what happens in the ensuing coping processes that Black youth use. So again, I'm sure he'll unpack, but if not, that citation at the bottom will allow for a greater unpacking of what we present in the RECAST model. But essentially, racial socialization is a very helpful strategy to interfere between what happens in the world with our Black kiddos and how they ultimately cope and have psychological wellness as a result of that coping. So one of the things that we were able to do with that theory is to create the engaging, managing, and bonding through race intervention. So I want to take the next 5 minutes to quickly explain what it is Embrace is about and to, again, highlight some of the things that our youth have indicated. So Embrace is a 5-session family-based intervention, which is designed to increase parent and adolescent racial socialization abilities, reduce parent and adolescent racial stress and trauma, and improve the outcomes of adolescents psychologically and academically. We do that through engaging in racial socialization content. So to have the talk and to be unapologetic in talking about race, to manage stress. So Dr. Stevenson will talk a bit about what CLCB is and what it looks like. And that's one of the strategies for managing stress, and bonding. So how do we continue to have a rich family relationship in the midst of really challenging conversations? The Embrace theory of change maps on to RECAST. And so again, the basic point here is to say that we're targeting discriminatory stress. We do that through racial socialization competency, and we're ultimately hoping to change some of the coping strategies and outcomes affiliated with that. And when we share our slides, hopefully you'll be able to see some of this content a bit more in depth. What we do at this point is work with Black 10 to 14-year-olds and their caregivers. They receive compensation for their time, and we recruit from schools, behavioral service agencies, and word of mouth in our communities. We've developed a clinical manual and accompanying participant guide. These things are developmentally appropriate for parents, children, and family. They're also culturally appropriate. And we have 30-minute parallel sessions, which means we work with each person separately in the family, bring them together for a dinner, and then have a 45-minute family-based conjoint session. So briefly, just want to show you a very quick clip of some of the media that we use within Embrace to facilitate these conversations. So this is a conversation about growing up Black, focusing on Black boys.
My parents taught me, oh, you know, cops are your friends. You're supposed to, you know, they're here to protect you. But all I'm seeing is the opposite. So how can I not be afraid when I feel like I'm being hunted?
So that,
when I feel like I'm there to fill a quota.
That comment right there, how with respect to hunting, we asked the parent in the video, a child says he's being hunted. What has it been like as a parent to have a Black child at a time where they feel hunted? And to the child, we would ask, how does it feel that your parent would have to warn you about racism, to be that being hunted? So that is something that we might use from a media perspective to show families how you can engage in this talk frequently and not just one time. It could be anything that you're watching on TV or that you're picking up in a book that can elicit this conversation. So quickly, just to show you some results quantitatively, I'll focus your attention on the parents. Essentially, when they start the intervention, they say that they can cope well, but then there's a dip in their coping abilities. And by the end, we're not only increasing in coping, but we're higher than when folks came in. So they are becoming habituated to some of the stress of talking about and dealing with discrimination, and we're showing that in parents and youth as well. Youth indicated with respect to engaging, well, it felt good because like we can talk about like what we've seen. So like we won't have anger built up inside of us. And another youth indicated it was exciting. I'm talking. It helped me be able to get the feelings out, because if I didn't, it would have a negative impact on my character and morals. I'm going to skip past managing for a bit and indicate that with bonding, families said that it continued to help them communicate through some of the challenges that they had not been able to discuss before. But also want to show you one more clip. This is Ben, and this is his experience with Embrace.
Embrace helped me open up about some racial situations that actually happened to me, and it served as a support group for what I was thinking, to help me think through what I was thinking. It also served as a catalyst for conversations strictly about race instead of having race as the subtext of a conversation.
So youth are really appreciating that focus and ability to talk about it specifically. With future directions, we definitely want to understand how children and parents in Embrace differ. So when we have a larger sample, we'll see how boys actually do benefit from Embrace separately from the whole group. And we want to understand from the children, what is it that they're bringing to their parents when they're experiencing discrimination. I want to just leave you with one beautiful sentiment that my best friend sent me yesterday. If you think that boys of all ages are not understanding the beauty and the richness of being Black and how having this experience is impacting them, take a listen to BG, who is 4 and is living in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Is one every boy and sing for heaven.
I hate to interrupt my beautiful BG, but just to let you know, he has a wonderful presence and purpose here on this earth, and he is letting us know that victory is to be won with his generation. So thankful to the Black boys who are part of our program, and really excited to hear Dr. Stevenson's presentation next.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. This was amazing. I'll turn it over to Dr. Stevenson.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. McClure and Dr. Anderson, for sharing. And you touched on points that I am going to pass through quickly so we can get to Q&A. I'm so excited to be on this panel, and I really thank the division for inviting me and to not only hang out with my colleagues, but to share a little bit. I'm going to take off from where Dr. Anderson left. When we think about embracing, what are we trying to embrace in young people? And at one point I would like to say, imagine if you had interventions like Embrace that she described that taught that if you're really going to work with boys of color, and particularly Black boys, that not only do the young people need to know, but the interventionists also need to understand that racism and colonialism is first about a narrative of dehumanization. And to realize that dehumanization is a feature, not a bug. It is not temporary, and it's about framing others as animals as well as denying the human qualities to a group or people, and that is historical, cultural, spiritual, social, emotional, and physical, and that our interventions must be able to and must be situated to address that. Imagine if racism and colonialism is violently enacted through police brutality since this country began. Imagine if interventions included knowledge about how that dehumanization is perpetuated through subjugation, and those who are nice but racially incompetent, right? Not necessarily eager to destroy the other, but just not know. And then also imagine if our interventions and our work understood that this dehumanization is triggered through threat reactions to what I think of as a narcissistic kind of whiteness that misinterprets, distorts the moment, and face-to-face sort of encounters. We talked about already the current rise in hate in this country since 2016. And what many people don't realize is that a lot of this hate speech and violence has increased, but it's happened around schools. So educators, as well as parents, are struggling over how do we have these conversations? How do we navigate these attacks? My colleagues have already talked about racial stress and trauma. I would just like to throw out, not only is the research linking it to dehumanizing climates, but poor quality of teacher-student relationships, as Dr. McClure is related to, and spoke about student achievement outcomes, intergenerational net wealth and health, and work disparities. But I also want to bring out the point that we know more about how racial stress and trauma affects blood pressure, sleep, and our very breathing. And in many respects, the legal approaches that are necessary to change systemic racism are important, but they can't fully heal racial stress and trauma. And in that sense, we need to think about other ways, including racial mindfulness, social emotional learning and healing, and culturally responsive practices. So the work that we've been doing for quite a while now, so is focusing on right now, what's happening when young people, when boys are in face-to-face encounters. And so we think of these encounters as overburdening our emotions, our physiology, our cognitions, and our voice. And so what I'm going to talk about is, what do we do in these sort of moments, or what can boys do to navigate the stress and overwhelm that occurs in these encounters? That could be what's going on with me in the moment when I'm with somebody, or before this encounter and after this encounter. And so a lot of the approaches that we think about around race is ideological and not so much emotional. And the theory that Dr. Anderson was referring to, RECAST theory, is basically in a nutshell saying, if we have this research that suggests that racial socialization is a protective factor, children who receive more information or parents who talk to their children more, those children are more likely to look better on some health and well-being outcomes. But we don't often know why that is the case. And so RECAST is suggesting that one thing that talking to children about race does is it allows them to be exposed to future racial interactions and prepare them for it. And so in many respects, by improving the confidence of young people to not avoid or somehow internalize the inferiority of racial microaggressions, they can find other ways to engage those moments, speak up, find their voice. And so RECAST is a theory to understand functionally why racial socialization and what we're going to call racial literacy can be used to actually help young people be much more agentic. So in a way, we're advancing racial socialization towards racial literacy, where literacy is more about, what skills do I have? What skills can I teach my young people, my children, Black boys, to navigate a world that's going to face them repeatedly with hostility? And so in our work, we prioritize in vivo training over information lecturing and didactic learning. And we're interested in self-care first. And that is that young people are thinking about what's going on with them emotionally. And that self notion can be extended self. What's my community also how is my community being cared for? We are very interested in issues of competence over character. A lot of people think that being good demonstrates somehow a racial equity of sorts, when in fact we don't judge other jobs and resources through character. You can be a great person and a really good person, but if someone wanted to hire you to be an algebra teacher and you couldn't count, your character would not be that big an issue. That is, we wouldn't want somebody who, for example, was a police officer who has a good person, but still cannot navigate the politics of racial antagonism. And competence of protecting and serving is more important than being a good person. And racial stress, we understand, is also something that's uniquely different than other kinds of stressors. So in our work, we're more interested in how do our interventions, as you heard around Dr. Anderson's work on Embrace, how is it going to help our health and our healing? So racial literacy I've defined as the ability to read, recast, and resolve a racially stressful moment or encounter. And reading, in a sense, is about how well do we observe what's going on in that moment? How well do we decode the subtext in these interactions? And how well do we interpret written and social discourse as well, not only in relationships, but in media and written text? Recasting is this ability to actually notice what's going on with me and what level of stress I'm at, and can I positively reframe it and conceive of it in ways that it's more workable. And the racial mindfulness approach that we use to actually engage folks to engage recasting. It's called CLCBE, which stands for Calculate, Locate, Communicate, Breathe, and Exhale. And in a nutshell, calculate would simply be, if I'm in a racial moment, what feelings am I having right now? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense are they? So if you imagine when we witnessed George Floyd's murder, just what was going on with us? Can I notice? I remember feeling disgusted at a level of a 10, and my stomach was sickening. And that's where calculate gives us a sense. What's the intensity of my feelings right now? Locate is where in my body did I feel it? And that disgust I felt in the pit of my stomach. And it was sickening to me in a way. Communicate is about what self-talk, what was I saying to myself, and what images came to mind. And my self-talk was just around rage. If I could just, what would I do if I was there? If that was somebody I knew. And the images that came to mind of my children, of my uncles, of my friends, those images were fluttering in my head. And so calculate, locate, and communicate is a way for us to have much more of a sense of what's going on with me in this moment. How do I embrace my thoughts? How do I embrace my feelings? How do I embrace where those feelings are affecting my movement and my body? And then breathing and exhaling is important when it comes to knowing how do I bring oxygen back into my brain, right? Because if we're at an 8, 9, or 10 in anger, or if a police officer is at an 8, 9, or 10 in anger, they're lousy decision makers. We're all lousy decision makers. And breathing and exhaling allows us to bring oxygen to our brain, restore our peripheral hearing and seeing in a way that we can make better judgments based on better data. So I am, sorry. Yeah. So in a nutshell, let me see, I think I got a freeze here. All right, cool. So resolving, which is the last sort of definition of racial literacy, is how well, when I'm in that encounter, am I able not only to reframe and reduce my stress level, am I able to use my voice to communicate during that moment so that I walk away not feeling like I wish I could have, should have said something or done something. And do I walk away making a decision that matches my social justice values? So as I wrap up, the one question that people often ask us is how do we do this? And I would say racial literacy takes practice. Now, some of you are saying practice. We're talking about practice. Yes, we are talking about practice, thanks to the wonderful words of the great philosopher Allen Iverson. Now, the question is, how do we practice? We practice through storytelling, through journaling, through debating, through role-playing. All of these have very different purposes in trying to help people develop a sense of courage and empowerment to be able to engage racial encounters, whether they're coming face-to-face or through media or through relationships of folks who are close to us. I want to end on a couple of things, just basically that, this quote by Martin Luther King, I love because he's not a prophet. He's not a preacher. He's not a civil rights leader. He becomes a parent in this moment when you hear him because he's overwhelmed, because he says, you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky. And I love this quote because as a parent, we all struggle. And for our boys and our daughters and all of those we consider our children, whoever they are, blood related or not, I think our job is to keep these ominous clouds of inferiority from forming in their little mental skies. And I have, in many respects, thought of all of our interventions. What if we included in them what Black boys have to go through day in and day out? And these are two of mine who, in many respects, they're now 29 and 15, but they'll still be babies to me. And so this work isn't just a job, it's life. And our work is based on this proverb: the lion story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. And in our work, we have a nonprofit called Lion Story, which supports these notions, both in practice as well as in research. Tell your story, heal the village, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, Stevenson. So I appreciate all of the amazing presentations today and the wonderful questions that people provided us. Unfortunately, we only have about 10 minutes to answer some questions, so we're not going to be able to address everyone's question. I will say that for those of you that are interested in having access to the PowerPoints, the slides will be available at a later date. And so the content will be emailed to you, and so you can be able to access that.